Hey, everybody. Welcome to Getting Into It with Grant. I'm happy to say that I've had the pleasure of speaking not just with one, but two members of the company Memrise now. I first spoke with Steve Toy, their CEO, last time, and now for this episode, I got to speak with Ben Whately. Ben is a co founder and their current CSO, or Chief Strategy Officer. Usually, when I put together an episode, I have like a rough outline of what it is I want to talk about with my guest. Well, in this episode, we went way off script, which was great because I found the topic of conversation so interesting that I couldn't let the opportunity pass me by. It's clear that Ben is very intelligent and very passionate about education and language learning, so it's no wonder that Memrise was successful. He and I talked about how the brain actually learns a language and some of the issues with classical education and how it teaches language in a more rigid manner than the brain wants to learn it. So we did change gears later in the episode and talk about what it was like at an early stage startup, obtaining venture capital and investments as well. So if you're interested in starting your own tech company one day or here because you're interested in how the brain works, well, we talk about it all. So before we jump into this episode, if you like these interviews and want to be on the show, or if you want to sponsor an episode, let me know by emailing me at hello@grantdryden.com. And now, here's our conversation. All right, Ben, thanks for joining me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to talk with you today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So, last time I talked with Steve, and he had some really good answers to the questions that I had about Memrise. And so today, what I wanted to do was kind of talk to you about those early days. As one of the co founders and the current CSO of Memrise, I just wanted to get an idea of how your background helped take this product from an idea into a reality in those first days, what it kind of looked like launching a startup company, and then how you help lead the business today as well. So with that, maybe I'll start after you graduated high school. You went to college. What did you do there? How did you meet the people that were your co-founders?
Yeah, as a teenager, I got really into building and using neural networks, which was a bit geeky. It was actually combining geekiness with high risk tolerance, which is probably the description of a tech entrepreneur, of someone destined to fall into tech entrepreneurship. So I got into it because I was trying to use them to predict the results of horse races. And I became convinced that I could
Wow.
spot patterns in those massive data sets available and that I could use them to spot patterns. I never managed to do that very successfully, but that got me into studying neural nets. So I went to Oxford to study experimental psychology, specifically neuroscience within that, because I wanted to be building neural networks.
Hmm.
Um, while then studying neural networks, I was then getting more into studying the brain and how we store memories, how we learn, and started seeing I had a kind of working mental model for, or at least I noticed the way that I spoke about memory and learning was as though there was this thing called memorization where you learn a fact and
Hmm.
then you learn to do stuff with that fact. And a great example of that would be you learn the fact of the meaning of a word and then you learn grammar rules to create sentences with it. Now, that's not how the brain works.
Hmm.
And it's not a very good metaphor at all. And the idea we talk about trying to retrieve that memory, like we're trying to sort of retrieve a file from a filing cabinet, it's just not how it
Hmm.
works. Our memories are fully distributed. They're not. You don't go to a place to store the memory. It's distributed across the network. Um, and the way that and learning is not a process of like storing an exact fact. It's like we have this myth of photographic memory. You don't store a photograph in your mind. You store a processed version of what you took from it. So you can have a clear picture in your mind that you can remember. That doesn't mean that's what you saw. There can be a huge difference. You saw
Wow.
that is what you processed and then remembered. Um, and there are a lot of examples of how people can just have completely false memories of things. But what that what I got particularly interested in was how that impacts learning of languages. And as I say, this idea that I had kind of been taught this model of language learning as you learn words and then you apply grammar rules to them. And I'd found it useless. Like I was very bad at learning. The only thing I learned at language lessons at school was that I was bad at language, which is not actually true. I have a human brain, and like every other human, my
Hmm.
brain compulsively learns languages. It can't help it. If you are in a situation where you are trying to understand another person and you're
Hmm.
motivated to try and get them to understand you, you will learn a language. It's what your brain does. You can't help it.
Hmm.
And it will learn it because it's spotting patterns in the input and then it's trying to make sense of them. We constantly try and make sense of the patterns that come in. When we look at clouds, we try and see what they look like.
Hmm.
We're always looking for spotting patterns that we're familiar with. And so when we hear patterns of language coming in, we try and make sense of them. Um, and so and so what it occurred to me is that the problem was not just in the way I was being taught. The problem was that the the process of learning a language is actually mostly about effective practice.
Okay.
And I was being given, it's maybe 20% of a good language learning journey is actually learning stuff, and 80% is just going out and practicing it. Actually, you can get there without the 20% of learning. You can't just practice. That's what every child on the planet has ever done.
Yeah.
That's how you learn a language. You can go faster if you put in about 20% of your time into learning stuff. Makes the practice more effective.
Hmm.
And the problem with my language education was that I'd been given 95% learn and 5% practice,
Hmm.
which is kind of like teaching someone to swim in a classroom and then at the end of it throwing them in a lake and be
Right.
like,
Very different.
hey, you passed the exam. And maybe there's 5% practice, so maybe every fifth lesson you pour a bucket of water over their head just to get them used to the water, but it's no more useful than that. That is literally what
Yeah.
happened in my language learning career at school. So okay, I'm rambling on. So that
No,
was
no,
like
you're all good.
that was how I got really into the study of second language acquisition. It was via artificial intelligence. Well, in those days, I just thought of it as neural networks.
Hmm.
Then what has become these kind of large language models um,
Yeah, so
that
this is
we.
good. I've got a couple questions here as you've been talking through this. This has gone in a direction I didn't expect. I'm really interested. So when you talked about the
Did you
distributed
not expect to be
nature,
interested? Sorry, I'm joking.
no, I expected to talk to you about a startup company, but this is really fascinating stuff. Because when you talked about learning a language and it being part of the distributed network of a person's brain, some of the things I've heard about how to remember things is to construct like a 3D location in your mind, like your house. And if you want to remember
Yeah, so
objects,
memory palace
right?
can work super well, and that's just playing into the ways that our brain works naturally. In a way, it's like
Uh-huh.
hacking the fact that we are spatial creatures that are really good at remembering place. And so,
Hmm.
if you want to learn information that is fundamentally uninteresting to your brain,
Uh-huh.
you can give it a context and plug it in.
Okay.
And but there's an important point about that our brains are highly efficient. They learn
Hmm.
the things that we need to learn to go about our daily life. When you're hacking it like that, you're
Hmm.
kind of you're trying to get your brain to remember something that actually doesn't for survival it doesn't really need to learn, and that
Hmm.
can be a really useful thing to do, but you've also got to realize that your brain's efforts to simplify and only learn the useful stuff is also super important. And so where just refer it back to language learning again,
Hmm.
you naturally learn to use grammar constructions in the order in which they are important to convey meaning, not in the order that they're taught in a syllabus. And there's a great
Okay.
example of this that every second language learner learning English learns, like in lesson one, that in the third person singular, you put an S on the end. So, like, I eat, he eats.
Hmm.
Learn it right at the start. Grammar rule. Now you've learned that rule, you can do it to that word. When you see the word eat, you can apply this grammar rule to it. No English language speaker, learner, gets to use that construction until they're upper intermediate.
Okay.
They never do it. You teach it to them in lesson one, you repeat it in all the other lessons, doesn't make any difference. They don't do it until they're upper intermediate. And the reason they don't is that it doesn't convey any meaning. It's totally unimportant.
Right.
Um, it, it it's redundant. If I say he eat the fish, you know exactly what I'm saying. No one's confused.
Yeah,
And
for
your
sure.
brain, and that's your brain taking a shortcut. Your brain is only learning the bit it actually needs to learn in order to get its
Hmm.
message across. And then at some point, it also doesn't want people to like look at them like they're slightly stupid. And so it's like, okay, I get the picture. I'll put an S at the end. But it's only a very incremental bit of meaning. So uh, back to memory palaces, it's a really cool technique,
Hmm.
and it can be really, really useful for specific things. So, um, for example, if you learn poetry, it can be a really great way of getting that initially into your brain. So
Okay.
I have 4 children. They're terrible at going to sleep, or they were when they were younger. And I had to spend a long time lying in bed next to them, trying to help them go to sleep.
Hmm.
And I found that if I told them stories, they're like, tell me a story. But the problem with the story is if it's an exciting story, they don't go to sleep.
Hmm.
And if it's a boring story, they're just like, Dad, this is a boring story. Why can't something interesting happen? They're
Yeah.
almost interested by the boringness. So what I alighted on was that you could just recite poetry to them
Okay.
that has a rhythm to it and a feeling to it, and they can kind of engage with it, but kind of the language might go a little bit over their head sometimes, and
Hmm.
it would reliably shut them out. And so I used a memory palace to go around and put each. I can still remember it. In my parents' house, where I spent my teenage years, starts off outside the back door. There was a little down pipe and a drain pipe
Hmm.
down there, and right there, I've got a little picture of a bridge, and it's How Horatius Held the Bridge from the Lays of Ancient Rome by Thomas Babington Macaulay, which
Nice.
is his poem that then goes on line by line. I can follow that through the house. I go in the back door, I go along there into the loo,
Hmm.
and it,
Wow.
I can do about an hour and a quarter of that entirely through this memory palace. And as I go through it, I
Wow.
still follow
Hmm.
my way through. It's quite hard to start midway through, but I can kind of, I used to be able to do it, but now the detailed memory has slightly faded. And if I go like onto the back veranda, I'm like, "Phew, hold on. Yeah, it'll take me a little while.
Right. Got to
I'm from the Rock of
reinvigorate those
Tarpeian, now I'm
neurons.
like the Weinberger spy. A line of burning villages red in the midnight sky. So
Wow.
I can get there, but it takes a little while to recall that. And I think those memory techniques are super powerful for those kinds of things where you're leading your brain slightly outside the scope of what it does
Hmm.
naturally to be a surviving human being.
Awesome. Well, that actually that gives me a great idea because I do two podcasts. So I do this one and then also one called Storytime with Dad. I've got three kids myself. 6 year old, a 2 year old, and almost 1 year old. And I started that podcast when my daughter, my eldest, was born. And I try and exactly like you said, right? Like some stories are so exciting it prevents them from sleeping, and other ones just aren't engaging. And so, having it on a podcast and just hearing my voice, I try and speak in like a soothing manner.
Soothing way. Yeah, great. I always meant to do that, but kudos to you for actually doing that. I used to lie there trying to tell the stories, and I was always like pretty tired at the end of a day. And do you know Baba? Do you have that? The story of the
Yeah.
elephant? Yeah.
Hmm.
So I one time I remember telling a story and I was super tired and I kept on drifting off to sleep as I was talking and then
Hmm.
waking up again and hearing my voice as I was talking. And it was like I was drifting in and out of consciousness. And I decided I had to stop telling stories after I woke up to find myself saying, and Celeste discovered that Baba had become involved with a French woman. And, and I was like, and they were like, what? Baba's having an affair. I was like, well, I'm sorry.
Oh my
Jesus, I
gosh.
cannot trust my subconscious. I don't know what's going on. So I had to bail on telling stories. And I was like, okay, I'm going to stick to poetry in future.
Oh
Memory
my gosh, it's
palaces.
too funny.
Okay.
Yeah, so memory palaces then. So it sounds like those are mostly for things that may be obviously memorization or things that are not things that you want to engage with. And language learning is really all about putting it to use, right? You
Yeah,
should want to
exactly.
use
So
it or have a reason to.
we have done a lot of, there's another memory technique of using mnemonics, which like when I was learning Chinese, character learning to read Chinese, that was
Hmm.
super important. You know, creating mnemonics for what each character looks like can speed up your learning to read in Chinese like 1,000 times. It's so
Okay.
effective. And you can also do it for words, what things sound like. Um, so in French, please is s'il vous plaît. And I
Uh-huh.
remember I had a mem which was a picture of a silver platter, and it was like, please, can you bring it to me on a silver plate? And it's like silver plate. And it doesn't get you all the way there,
Oh
but it's
yeah.
something that your brain can start gripping onto, where otherwise sounds are just totally amorphous and you can't really get a grip on them. And so it starts to give you a way to get a grip on it. But pretty quickly, you want to graduate to hearing the word and immediately meaning being there.
Uh-huh.
And when you do that, you no longer want to use the mnemonic. So the mnemonic can be helpful in getting you started, but pretty quickly you move to the more important thing being, when someone says it, do I understand it?
Yeah.
And we actually have now within the product shortcutted to that. We found that actually the mem stage, the creating a mnemonic stage, it can help if your task is to pass a vocab test where you've got to learn 500 words. Then yeah, some mems can help you do that. But actually, that's a bit of a cul-de-sac
Hmm.
uh, in terms of your actual learning. Like you don't need to learn the translations. You need to understand when someone speaks. So
Yeah.
better to focus yourself straight on that problem, and your brain will solve that problem. I actually, as an example, I when learning the first thing, the first content we had on Memrise was Chinese, and I was using it. It was the content I was creating to teach
Oh, good.
myself to read Chinese. Was the
Hmm.
first content that we put onto Memrise. And but one of the things I found, yes, it made you learn much faster, but I also found this an interesting side piece was that I got to the stage where I would see a Chinese character and I would start typing it, the word in English,
Hmm.
before I had the understanding of what it was.
Oh.
And so my brain had actually shortcut to
Hmm.
the response of what letters to type before I had the understanding,
That's
which is
neat.
kind of insane that
Hmm.
you learn to do the task that you're given. And your brain is so good at not learning to do any other bullshit and
Yeah.
forgetting things that it doesn't need to know. And so, yeah, I just learned that shortcut. That was in early days Memrise. That's why we now do a whole mix of tests and tests from videos and tests from audio to reduce the chances of you getting one of those false learning paths where
Yeah.
you can only do it in the context of being shown it or memorized and then you know what to type it. It's like I sometimes, if people actually another thing in China on the ATM machines, the number pad, they don't
Hmm.
seem to have a convention of starting with zero at the top, then going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9,
Hmm.
or starting at the top, starting at the bottom with zero, and going 1, 2, 3, and going back up the other way. And that meant that I'm so used to doing my pin numbers by position
Oh yeah.
that I scarcely even know what my pin number is. It's just I go to it and I know it's do. And
Yeah.
so when um, I used to get my cards followed by the machine the whole time because I go up and I'd be like, "Oh crap! Is it? It? It's that one? That one? Oh, Jesus, which way up is it?" And again, because I just learned the
The
act, my
positional
finger had learned
relationship
the
with the
action,
numbers.
and I no longer knew what the number was. Yeah.
Hmm. Goodness.
We're way off. We're way off startup stuff.
Well, this is great. This is about how the brain works, and it's really neat to hear all of these different tricks and pathways through the brain where you're relating like visual tasks to motor tasks, right? And
Mm,
you're skipping that. It was, I think it was I Love Lucy way back in the day. It was Ricky had told Lucy like he translates the English into like Cuban or whatever his language is in his brain, and then he translates it back. And I feel like as a product of classical education, that's a lot of what I did or do probably still when I'm thinking like Spanish, right? So I took Spanish in high school. I took it for 3 years, and it was frustrating to me because they teach you AR, ER, IR verbs. And so you're locked into this pattern of how you map like first person and second
mm,
person, third person. and you're boxed into only those AR verbs. But I found quickly it's like, well, you can't really say a whole lot because you've got to mix and match all of the different verb types. And so I found that classical education to be very frustrating for me personally. And so I would do self study and kind of jump ahead in the books and like screw the whole thing up. And so I think my teacher both enjoyed seeing that, but was also like, Grant, stay in your box because it's hard to grade your papers. And so I appreciate how you've gone about this. It's making it more functional and learning the
Well,
things that
it's
you need to
also
know. And Mhm,
just on a motivational level. To to get to fluent in a language, you've got to learn a
mhm,
whole ton of stuff. But to be able to do a particular conversation, you actually don't have to learn very much at all. To stay motivated, like I could teach you to navigate a tea shop in China. I could probably get you through that conversation in 15, 20 minutes of memory.
mhm,
Yeah, it's a pretty simple ring fence task. You're asking for a couple of things. You're understanding the things they're likely to say back. It's pretty scoped and tight. Um, but what the challenge is keeping you motivated from point one to fluent when there's
mhm,
all this stuff to learn. And if you're just learning all of the structure of the language before you start to be able to do stuff, it's a long time before you get a real reward and payoff. And really, the
mhm,
moment when you make someone laugh in the language, you tell a joke, you have a bit of a human connection. That's the point at which you start feeling really motivated and like, okay, I've got this. I can get
mhm,
somewhere. Um, whereas we tend to teach around very functional things, like buying a bus ticket. Yeah,
mhm,
actually, the conversation you want to have in a cafe is something that where you kind of share a little joke with the barista. You have a little moment where you feel like I'm not a tourist. I'm a person that is here in relationship with you as a person, and that's what we really need to kind of prioritize. But to this point, we when you're learning through a syllabus, and we design a syllabus or teachers design a curriculum or syllabus, um, you are learning so much that you don't need in order
mhm.
to have that first magical moment, that all your
Right.
energy and enthusiasm and motivation is being wasted on irrelevance.
Mhm,
And what we do at Memrise is try and create courses that are totally bespoke to your interests and are
mhm,
totally the shortest route to you want to be able to connect with someone in that situation. Here's pretty much the shortest route you can get there. It's going to be like 15 words. You're going to watch a bunch of videos of those words being used. You're going to
mhm,
see real people saying them with different accents, with in slightly different contexts at different speeds. And then you're going to practice having a conversation about it yourself using all of that. You're not going to be able to have every conversation about it, but you're going to be able to have that conversation in a way that helps you to connect with someone. And then
mhm.
you've got one conversation in the bag. And then you can go and have the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And that's really the most efficient way to build up whilst maintaining motivation.
Yeah, so maybe this is a Grant problem here, but how are you all approaching the person to person interactions? Because so I know Spanish, but I'm still embarrassed when I talk to a real person who speaks
Right.
that fluently. Do you have any advice for how a person can get over that hurdle?
Yeah, so I do have some advice on that, Grant. So what we built last year, um, we've built various versions of this over the last 10 years because it's such an important problem. It's like to speak a new language, you need to get good at understanding people. You need to get um, which means hearing enough target language input. Then you need to get good at expressing yourself, which basically is about overcoming your embarrassment about
Hmm.
being rubbish at speaking the language. And then you just need a ton of practice at it. And so getting over that embarrassment requires you practicing. So over the years, we built various versions of this, but it all really changed when GPT-3 came out
Hmm.
2.5 years ago, nearly 3 years ago now.
Wow.
And we started building on that, trying to build up because we said as soon as we saw it, we were like, this is a technology that allows us to create human-like conversation
Hmm.
without a human being present. And at the same time, improvements like Whisper AI building on giving improved speech to text, which is now
Mm-hmm.
pretty flawless. You look at things like Siri that were getting quite good, but Whisper AI is just an order of magnitude better.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this coming together means that we could create a a conversational AI where we can get you to role play a ton of situations and role play situations where you're trying to do something. Again, it's about this connection. It's not just buy a coffee. It's um, I know one of them is it's not just buy a car. You have to persuade the salesman to sell you the car for less than $500. So you have a bit of tension with the salesman. There's a bit of like
Mm-hmm.
you're trying to persuade them. You're trying to try out some tactics, trying to make something happen, and
Mm-hmm.
that gives it a kind of frisson, gives it an excitement, as well as just giving you that access to spoken language conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we find is that if people go into a practice conversation and they go through 5, 10 repetitions of a conversation, it's pretty low. Actually, people tend to start off typing because even speaking in the comfort of your own room is a bit embarrassing. But so people start off typing and they get kind of comfortable out, like, okay, I know what to say. And then you show them a few more videos, a few more people, attractive people using language and talking, like, okay, they sounded cool. I want to be cool like
Mm-hmm.
that. And I go back and I'm over the fact I know that I know what to say because I've done it with typing. So now go back and do this out loud and have the conversation with the bot. And once
Mm-hmm.
you've been through 10 repetitions of speaking through a conversation, then when you put yourself in the real life situation, it's not a big jump to talk.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I've done this a bunch of times, and you, our brains work by going down the path of least resistance and what they are
Mm-hmm.
used to doing. So if you just get your brain used to having a conversation, used to understanding and responding to what they say, then you go into a live conversation, and that's no longer threatening. And one of the things we're trying to overcome is kind of a bit of a design fault in the brain where um, for for these particular use cases, it is a bit of a design fault that we stress is very good for helping you form memories.
Mm-hmm.
If a really intense experience is very memorable, but they are stress is very bad for helping you recall memories.
Okay.
And the and you see that because when you're stressed, when you go to try and practice in front of a native speaker, you get stressed, you start worrying about how stupid you're going to look, they're going to judge me, it's going to be embarrassing, oh my
Yeah.
God, I'm stressed, and you can't remember anything. And
Mm-hmm.
the way that people get over that traditionally is that they go and have a couple of beers. And then they're like, okay, I'm less stressed now. I'm pretty chilled. So now my Spanish is all of a sudden brilliant. A problem with that, and there are other problems, but a problem with that is that alcohol does also slightly impact your ability to recall, but
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't impact it as much as stress does. So alcohol's
Okay.
ability to suppress your stress is more important than its deleterious effect on recall.
Yeah. Well, that's why they call it liquid courage, right?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Anyway, so my advice to you is not to go and get drunk. My advice to you
There you go.
is to go and practice on the Membot, as we call it. The Membot is our conversational AI that allows you to practice without getting in front of people and not having without having that stress.
Okay, so I presume there are going to be people who are listening to this episode who haven't downloaded the app, haven't used it before. How does one, is it easy to find Membot in the app? How does one get to that
Yeah, so
location?
if you download it, there are 3 tabs. So the kind of sequence that we take people through in Memrise, call it, we talk about our pedagogic stool. We've got a little yellow stool. Have I got one here? We have a little yellow stool with 3 legs,
Hmm.
and the 3 legs of the stool that hold up support you on your language learning journey are learn, immerse, and communicate. So learn is where you learn the words and phrases you need to. Immerse is where we find we using the words and phrases that you've learned, we then search the internet for thousands of videos from YouTube, TikTok, wherever else that you can now understand.
Hmm.
So even when you just learned 10 phrases, 10 words, we can start showing you videos because there are videos from Spanish TikTok that only use 5 words. So we can show
Hmm.
those to you. And these are actually funny videos that Spanish people find funny that are now part of your language learning journey. So that's the immerse part. And then we've got the communicate part where you practice talking to the bot. When you go into the app, you'll find there are 3 tabs: learn, immerse, communicate. And you just
Hmm.
cycle between those 3. And where you go and communicate and you have more conversations, you can add words in for you to learn. Um, to, so if you come across phrases that you think, oh, I'm going to need that later, you can go and add that to the words to learn. As you watch videos, likewise, you can say you can watch all the videos where we're like, you know all of these words, so enjoy those ones, and then we can show you videos like, you know most of the words here. If you learn a couple more words, then you got the whole video. And so you can use each of these kind of incentivizes you or opens up more to be done in the other. The more videos you watch, the more words get added to your list of words to learn. The more words you learn, the more videos get opened up.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that makes sense. Thank you for sharing how we get to there in the app, and so people who download it can start kind of learning whatever language they want to. I personally have a stake in learning Russian. My brother lived in Ukraine for like 10 years, and I tried to learn Russian, and it's been very difficult. Partly because I think the structure of the language, there's like 2 different ways you can do an L in your mouth, and so I actually had to have
Yeah.
a person coach me how to make the different types of vocalization, and the language itself is just very difficult. I found, and so I've kind of what I'll do is I rapidly hit a plateau with a lot of these languages, and so I've
Mm.
been interested in Korean and Spanish and Japanese and Russian, and so I've dabbled in a lot of different things, and so I think Memrise, getting access to Membot can help me kind of flesh out my abilities in a lot of these different languages. Just I like to collect them, right? It's not like I have a use for a lot of these languages, and so
Yeah, and what I'd
as you said,
encourage you is to also like operationalize them a bit. And it
hmm.
is that going swimming rather than just learning about the theory of swimming. And
Hmm.
that is what watching a bunch of videos that use the language it does make it much easier to internalize those grammar rules. And I think Russian, yeah, is one where it's a highly inflected language, and so there's a lot of grammar rules that you can learn. But you've also got to remember that Russian kids learn to be able to speak Russian even if they don't learn the grammar rules. So
Hmm.
you don't need it, and but you do need to have the right kind of contextual practice. If you watch loads of videos, you will that use words that you understand,
Hmm.
your brain will infer the grammar, and you will be able to pick that out. It will also be helpful to you to sometimes have it explained to you. Like I'm not saying that there's no use in saying, oh, by the way, when they're inflecting the verb in that way, this is what it means and this is why they're doing it. That can be a great shortcut. I'm not a fan of this. Rosetta Stone had that like children learn without translations. It's all through pictures, and
Yeah.
and you have to guess at what the picture is expressing. It's like this is stupid. Just tell me what it is, and I can translate it. You don't need to needlessly avoid being explicit and conceptual. As adults, we can understand concepts and that can help us move faster. But where we try to teach a language through led by the concepts, we're doing it upside down. It should be that you learn to be able to understand phrases. You then, in the context of that, get a partial explanation of the grammar of like, oh, by the way, that is le, not la, because the French have got this thing about masculine and feminine. You don't really need
Hmm.
to understand it, but it's just there are 2 different words for the. Don't worry about it. On we go.
Hmm.
You don't. On the one hand, you could not explain that at all, not very helpful, or you could over explain it and try and get everyone to totally understand how gender impacts adjectives and all the impact of it. Or you can
Hmm.
just say, look, there are two different words for the. Deal with it and move on
Right.
with your life.
And I imagine that mastery comes with time. So maybe at the beginning it's not super important. I've also heard the nightmare stories, particularly maybe it's Chinese or Mandarin, rather the ones with like the voice inflection, where if you use the wrong inflection or the wrong word, like you're completely misunderstandable, right?
Yeah,
How
although
much of
actually,
a problem is that?
so it's definitely a problem. Although I still think it's a problem with teaching people rules.
Okay.
So when you look at so the romanization system that is currently most popular is called pinyin, and that works by giving you a romanization of the syllable and then drawing a picture of what the tone of that syllable is. And that results in this situation where you first of all think of the word being ma, being ma, and then you try and impose a tone rule on top of it.
Oh, I
So you're
see.
constantly thinking ma, okay, it's second tone ma, or it's fourth tone ma, and you're doing this transformation in your mind as you go.
Hmm.
You then ask a native speaker what tone something is, and you see them just saying it to themselves a few times, listening to themselves say it, and they're like, I reckon it's might be a third tone or might be a second tone, not too sure. and, and and so with the tones as well, you get you say this syllable is a third tone, this character has a third tone, but if that's used before a second tone, it changes, and there are all these tone change rules, and it's a total head. It screws with your head,
Yeah.
and it means when you see Chinese learners trying to speak, they're there with their head going up and down because they're thinking it's an up tone and a down tone, and their brain is like trying to
Oh,
do
is that why?
something with it,
Okay.
and their head's like bucking like a bronco, and their voice isn't doing the right thing. If instead there was actually a competing romanization system called um, Guoyu Luomazi, which was developed by a man called Lin Yutang, after whom my son is named. But he he had an amazing insight. He was a native Chinese speaker, but an incredible insight into the way that English speakers would find it easy to process language. And he found a way of romanizing all of the syllables in Chinese, but without separating the romanization from the tone. So, for example, he would put xue. He if it has a rising tone, it would be spelled Shyue. And by doing the xue, sort of moving to the year, you kind of have to move the tone up. Xue. And so you do this second tone without thinking, oh, I'm doing that syllable and then putting a second tone
Hmm.
on it. Whereas xue would just be Shue
Hmm.
because you don't do the Y, so it doesn't do it. But then we as Western people don't think of those as two different tones on the same word. We think of them as different words.
Yeah.
And
You think it's
and
a
so
better approach?
yeah, I think it's a much better romanization system.
Hmm.
The problem is, it's a better romanization system given that you are a Western person or an English speaker trying to learn Chinese.
Hmm.
The problem is that the overwhelming use of pinyin in the world is to
Hmm.
let Chinese people type on a keyboard. And
Oh.
they don't give a damn about what we find easy to learn. so, and since if you're going to use a Chinese keyboard and if you're going to type in Chinese at any point, you're going to need to learn pinyin.
Hmm.
So, you, either you've got to learn two romanization systems or you're going to learn one. And Guoyu Luomazi is not good enough to mean you should learn two romanization systems.
Okay. So you think so to think that through then the Chinese like a native Chinese speaker then learns it all as one unit. not as different
Yeah,
like
they just learn a
vocalizations.
noise. So
Yeah.
um, the way that tones come around and come about in a language is when consonants are dropped from the end of a syllable. And so in English at the moment, like what might go to what, and
Hmm.
in order to really know what you're talking about, it kind of what get gets replaced by an uptone, and the T drops, and you get an uptone.
Hmm.
And but you wouldn't find it just on one word. Where it happens in languages, it happens consistently. It would happen consistently across the language of a sort of AT sound at the end of a word would turn to an uptone.
Hmm.
And those morphological change or phonological changes happen across a language all at once. Um, in fact, Navajo Indian, the Native American Indian language, Native American language,
Hmm.
I apologize, um, became tonal in the 1800s. It happens in a generation. So the
Hmm.
grandparents were speaking a non-tonal language, the grandchildren were speaking it tonally, and these shifts happen. Tang Dynasty Chinese had two tones. Modern Chinese has four. Um, Cantonese has more, six, eight, can't remember.
Okay. Yeah, the Navajo, they were the wind talkers or wind speakers or something in World War II, I think. We had used their language system to like as something nobody else in the world knew. So it was kind of like encrypted communications, I believe. I have
Right.
to double check that, but I remember a story like that happening. So that's neat about how tonal languages work. If you don't mind, I want to shift gears here a little bit. Now, you founded Memrise back in 2010, something
Yeah.
around there. So, what were those early first days like in terms of funding? And I mean, you were still in college, sort of, I believe. And so, how did you
No, no,
get this off the ground?
we've been out for a bit. I've been living in China
Okay.
for a while,
Uh huh.
um, learning Chinese and honing my ideas on second language acquisition, as well as starting a company, a motorcycle restoration factory,
Okay. Fun.
and a shirt tailoring company. Um, Ed, one of my co-founders, had been becoming a grandmaster of memory and had got very into memorization techniques. Other co-founder Greg been doing his PhD in neuroscience at Princeton. So we
Hmm.
all met doing experimental psychology at Oxford. Then we all went our separate ways, and then we came back together. I
Okay.
have been working on a tool for language learning and specifically Chinese. Greg and Ed were working on a memorization platform, and then we spent a summer in 2010. So we've been working respectively on that for a year before we brought it together. 2010, we brought that all together
Hmm.
um, into a language learning platform building on the memorization tools. We so initially we had basically no money, and we're just all working for nothing.
Hmm.
Then, so we went to Seed Camp, which is a kind of seed startup event in London, accelerator program. We got offered a place there, but we actually didn't take it. I think probably a mistake. I think it was a bit of hubris. I think it's a very good program, Seed Camp, and I think we would have benefited from it.
Hmm.
But we felt we could do better. We also were approached at that by a VC firm called Balderton, who are
Okay.
a tier one VC in London. We They didn't do pre-seed at that stage. They were kind of Series A outfit, but they got really excited. And the partner there, a guy called Mark Evans, who's like stellar, you know, one of the very top echelon of VCs in the UK, with an unrivaled track record, really. And so he wanted to go in. In fact, he said, "I'll do it I'll do it myself, and then we'll put it to the Balderton team once they're back from holidays, because this is like in August when you don't
Okay.
get stuff pushed through venture capital firms. He's like, I'll do it myself, and then let's put it to the investment committee once they're back. But I'm happy with it anyway. So that was how we got our first thing. It was just a strong vote of confidence from Mark,
Wow.
and then that took us through to. We then went on the Techstars program in Boston early in 2011, which then gave us this framework. It gives a couple of things. I mean, first of all, the startup ecosystem in London at the time was a long way behind. where it is now and a long
Hmm.
way behind the US. And we went to the US largely because we had quite a strong conviction that the way to build a really powerful business in this space was going to be through building a network effect of people who really loved the product and were telling their friends about it. It was a kind of a social viral loop of where people were finding the product much more effective than they expected, and that
Hmm.
would allow them to get a um, a level of progress in learning a language they hadn't expected, and that they would tell their friends. But in order to do that, we and by doing that we could build a business with tens of millions of users.
Hmm.
But in order to do that, we had to offer a product for free, and that if we put a paywall in front of it, we would stop ourselves ever getting enough data to
Hmm.
create a product that was engaging enough to actually solve the problems. Now, at the time in the UK, going around saying that you were trying to create a consumer product that you weren't charging for, VCs were not into that. Mark was
Right.
very, very rare. Mark's Canadian, and is very international in his outlook. And so he got it. But generally, the chances of raising money on that chat in London at the time, very slim. So we wanted to come to the US. So we went on the Techstars program in Boston, and yeah, did everything that we thought it should. Introduced us to a different kind of investor, introduced us, frankly, to a different kind of ambition among startup
Hmm.
founders, and also, honestly, a different kind of collaboration. There's still, there was still at the time quite an attitude of competition with other startups that meant that you should hide your work from them. Like it was quite common in London at the
Hmm.
time for people to say, "Oh, I've got an amazing startup idea. I'm not going to tell you until you sign an NDA." And whereas when we went on Techstars, actually, there was a company also based in Boston called Quizlet, another
Hmm.
learning app. And
Yeah.
Quizlet had about 2 million users when we were there in 2011. So in our view, they were like, "Whoa, those guys are huge, and they've made it."
Yeah.
And they're the big gorilla in the room, that we've got to compete with. And then we got in touch with the founder, and he could not have been more helpful or more open. A guy called Andrew Sutherland.
Awesome.
He was just like completely laughed at the idea that if his company wasn't successful, it was going to be because we'd eaten their lunch. He was like, "Guys, this is a big. We're talking about digital learning, a space that doesn't exist now that we're going to completely create in the next 15 years. Is big enough for both of us. Why don't we
Yeah.
help each other, given that we're in the same area? Like, let's help." And
Love
that
it.
was
Not a
so
zero sum
refreshing.
game.
It's not a zero sum game, and that was very clear in the startup ecosystem there in Boston. It's something that we were keen when we came back to London to model and show that that's how we thought about the world. And I
Hmm.
think London now is also a, a lot better at that. It's really pretty good. There's an amazing startup ecosystem. I still think, however much we get better at it in London, that there is something in the sort of American mindset of entrepreneurialism and exploration that we can always learn from.
Hmm.
Um, but it was certainly formative for us.
Yeah. Do you feel that culture of openness is still very prevalent in the startup world in the US and maybe even now in the UK?
So I haven't been active in a startup in the US for a decade,
Okay.
so I don't know. But from what I see, it looks like it is. And in the UK, yeah, I mean the level of collaboration is super high now, and we have very strong networks within accelerators. There are great networks of founder support, so founder to founder support. There's a lot
Hmm.
now. Um, I think an area where we still have a long way to go is in angel investors going back in and helping new startups. And it's
Okay.
something where we just don't have as many big exits yet in the UK that we have enough startup operator founders who've got the cash to go in and write, you know, 50, 10, 20K tickets a year. We just don't have that many
Hmm.
people. And that means most of our angel checks are coming from people who have got their money from the city.
Okay.
And that's where the big money is in London.
Hmm.
And that means, you know, it's great. They're giving money to early stage startups. And we've got I don't know if you know the SEIS Enterprise Investment Scheme,
Yeah.
which means it's basically a tax break that means you can put up to 100K a year into startups, and you
Hmm.
basically get 50% of it back from the government,
Wow.
which is amazing. So it means if I'm investing in an early stage startup at a
Mhm.
valuation of 1.5 million, I'm actually getting a valuation of 750K,
Yeah.
and that's pretty exciting
That's
stuff.
outstanding. Yeah.
So that's a huge thing, and for people, but so people coming out of the city, they've got some cash. It's like the tax wise, it just makes
Hmm.
sense to put these in, and it's kind of fun. So you get people doing it, but we don't have that value add that can drive the right sort of decision making for really successful early stage companies. And it is someone who's made their money in the corporate world is more likely to think about process and reducing risk and how to build a sensible company. Whereas what you need at the early stage of a startup is someone who's just like pushing you to be hugely ambitious, not care about building the business, care about de-risking the biggest question marks, and being very, very hacky and unsustainable about the way you're building your company.
Really?
And
Okay.
yeah, because you definitely, you're not going to be able to scale the way that you start. But the
Hmm.
worst thing you can do is waste your money building up processes before you know what's right. Spend
Yeah.
all of your money on testing things in the most lightweight way possible, promising things that you can't quite deliver on until you see that it's really worth delivering on it.
Hmm.
Then deliver on it. But if you spend your money trying to solve problems that are two chess moves away, you never earn the right to get to those problems. And
Yeah.
the early stage startup is about earning the right to care about those problems. And I think so. It's I think a big issue in the UK, and actually something that so I'm part of an angel investor group called Ventures Together that was set up to tackle exactly this problem. And it is 150 like startup operator founders in the UK ecosystem, but we act as we invest. Everyone makes their own decision to put in money, but it's one line in the cap table. So
Great.
startups get one investor, but they get the benefit of the full network. And so they can, when they have come across particular problems or when they're looking for particular advice, they've got this group of 150 people who have been there, done that, are currently doing it, who can offer really um, helpful advice on it. So that's,
That
yeah,
mhm. That sounds really
hopefully
powerful.
helping us hopefully helping us like catch up on that dimension with the US ecosystem.
Yeah. So you primarily invest in UK startups then, or are you open to global startups?
I'm open to global startups. I am right now overwhelmingly investing in climate tech, um, because that seems to me to be the most important
Yeah.
place
Uh,
where if I
As a
can
human,
make
I
a,
appreciate that.
yeah.
We'll all
So
benefit.
right. So I do some ed tech still because that is also important, and it's clearly runs in my veins. But the climate tech is where I'm really um, putting 90% of my effort.
Okay. So I think with venture capital come responsibilities for some of these early stage startups. And do you have any advice on what a founder should be wary of when taking on investors?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to have to go. I have a hard stop in 2 minutes, I'm afraid, but
Okay,
um,
that's fair.
I'll definitely field this one. So it you need to choose your investors very carefully. you need, so first of all, you need to know where the money's coming from. You don't want to be accepting money from places that you don't want to be accepting money from. You don't want your success to directly benefit things that you feel really strongly against. Sounds obvious, but check it.
Hmm.
You also want to be sure that you're not taking on someone who's going to limit your chances in the future. So there are some early stage investors who will ask for rights that are going to make it hard for you to work in future. You need to look for pretty founder friendly terms. If you give away too much of your company, if you give away a board seat too early, if you give away all of these things, it means that top tier investors, when they come in later, are going to look at it and be like, I'm not coming in with that guy on the board. Like,
Hmm.
this is dumb. This guy's going to get in the way. And top tier investors distinguish themselves by knowing when to get operationally involved and knowing when not to. Generally, the answer is not to, because you're backing a team to be good at doing something. If the
Yeah.
team needs you to go in, they're probably not the team that you want. Whereas generally, there is a class of more inexperienced investor who wants to de-risk their investment, wants to reduce their chances of losing, and they spend a lot of time on trying to protect their downside and try and make you do things that reduce risk. Reducing risk is terrible. That's the
Yeah.
biggest risk of all, because the more you reduce risk, the more average the thing that you're doing is. And
Hmm.
if you put an average input into a startup, you'll get an average output, and that's never going to work. The only way that you can get a non-average output is if you do something non-average input, and by definition, that is going to look high risk. But that is the that is the only move that can result in success. So if you have an investor who is trying to get you to de-risk um, or is trying to de-risk their investment in the wrong way, that can be a huge, huge problem. Of course, there is de-risking in the right way, where you look at what are your big questions, what are the big things that could break this business, and address those up front. And there's de-risking in the wrong way, which is like putting in terms on the investment that can protect my downside, that gives me a liquidation preference, so I get my money out first if the company liquidates, and things like that, that are terrible for the business.
Okay, that's really wise advice. So, to be respectful of your time, I know you got to drop here, but thank you, Ben, for taking your time to chat with me today. I learned a lot, and I know the people who listen to this will as well.
Grant, it was great to chat, and sorry to have to drop off so abruptly.
No problem. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Take care.
Once again, I want to give my thanks to the good people at Memrise, especially Ben and the gal I've been coordinating these episodes with, Emma Vignola. I'll also give a shout out for my kids' Storytime podcast since we talked about that. That's storytimewithdad.com, and you can listen to that podcast as well. So, as I said at the start, if you want to be on the show or sponsor an episode, reach out to me at hello@grantdryden.com. Go to grantdryden.com to follow me on social media, and I look forward to seeing you all again next time.